Okay, so ODM Android. Sounds like all of you have uh, read through at least some of the documentation. Um, did they read the stuff you put out there
Did you?
about the containers? The most recent one? Okay.
Are they beautiful?
So, last time we did some onboarding, I had some documentation of that. So I'm going to kind of run through that as well. So the kind of the whole gist, I don't know how much you guys know, but the whole gist behind ODM used to be called distribution. I'll just read it from here, but it says connect mobile brands to audiences via privileged home screen placement. That's kind of a flexible definition, but basically carriers and OEMs, we partner with carriers and OEMs who can give us placement, privileged placement, typically on the home screen that other advertisers don't have access to. And then we place our widgets and applications in that privileged real estate, so to speak, to monetize the devices. So now it's called ODM, on-device monetization. So that's kind of the gist.
Yeah. So basically, we basically right now we still use a company of Sprint, and we actually partner with a lot of carriers.
Make sure you speak up for the video recording because it's
Yeah.
recording.
So we partner with like different carriers within Sprint. So we're like Virgin, Boost, and all that carriers. When basically they every time a device gets activated, they go through they have an app that basically set up all the initial apps, and also as part of that process, they place our widgets on home screen. So that's how we get to users.
So yeah, so we were working on actually writing a more comprehensive documentation, but just haven't filled it out yet. But I'm actually going to use it as an outline of things to go through. So right now we're just kind of in the platform overview, platform summary. I already kind of talked about this. Privileged placement on the mobile device to display CPI-based advertisements. CPI means cost per install. So when you see a widget like Top Apps and it's advertising these applications, that means we get paid every time the user installs one of these applications. And basically, that's the business model. It's kind of like a billboard, if you will, on the home screen to advertise applications. And like I said, it's on the carriers and OEMs we partner with, it's on that home screen by default. Now, the mechanism that it gets onto the home screen varies by carrier and by OEM. Sometimes it's what would be like a true preload. It's part of the system firmware, and it's part the launcher places that widget on the home screen as part of its default configuration. For Sprint, it uses something called Sprint ID. So Sprint has their own kind of, they'll call it virtual preloads. So Top Apps or any of these applications that we deploy on there, they're not preloaded as part of the firmware, but what happens is when a Sprint device with Sprint ID, which is most Android devices on Sprint, when it is activated or booted up for the first time, Sprint ID runs, and Sprint ID is preloaded, and then it downloads a pack, a configuration to tell it what to load after activation. So it's called virtual preload, or it's kind of post-load, if you will. It's just, but it's still part of the, once that's loaded, it's still part of the default experience of the device. So, talking about privilege placement, like I said, usually it's like the home screen to the right, like that's where most of these widgets live. There are some other instances like we have something called MWeb, and that's not Android, that's a web app, but that would be like the home page, the default home page on the Chrome browser for all the Sprint Android devices or whatever carrier we're on. And that I can.
And it's not Chrome, it's some browser app. They have their own browser app.
Who?
Metro. Like I don't think they use Chrome.
Well, Metro doesn't use MWeb, but I'm pretty sure it's configured on the device to just be the default homepage even within Chrome. I think. Maybe it's the OEM's browser, but you can see that here. Again, it's showing this is really the part that pertains to ODM. It's those same advertisements, but it's embedded in the web page. And that's kind of like the carrier homepage, if you will, where they can pay their bill and stuff. So that's another example of privilege placement. Another example would be notification. So we run advertising campaigns by sending notifications, those notifications are delivered through the app's, mainly Top Apps application. But the reason I list it as a privileged placement is because, one, you can't do that if you're published on the Play Store because you can't advertise the notification bar, but we do, which is kind of interesting. But the other types of privileged placement is like chat head style overlay. So I don't know if I have any screenshots of that, but we have an app called App Checklist that it actually doesn't have like an icon on the home screen or a widget, but what it does after activation, it will pop a floating bubble like a chat head that says click here to get started with your new device or something like that. And then when they click it, it pops up an app wall similar to this grid of apps where it says select your free apps to get started. And so the idea there is it's kind of like I just got my new phone, I'm going to select what apps I want downloaded, and it's being kind of assisting you there and picking which apps you want to get started with, and then you select all of them, click done, and then it'll create a chat head for each of those apps, and when you're ready to go install it after playing around with your new phone, then you can click one of those chat heads and install it. And then I didn't list it here, but we do have something called the Metro App Store, which is that doesn't have a widget, but the icon to the app wall is loaded onto the home screen by default in the carrier folder called, I think it's like, it says Metro PCS. It's like a folder on the home screen, and it has a link icon to this application. So anyway, the basic gist with all of these is leveraging some partnership with the carrier or the OEM who can give us some type of placement that one wouldn't normally have, and then we monetize that space with CPI advertisements.
Basically, like when they install and open the app, we get money. Like let's say we get $10, and then we get some amount of that, like a commission.
Yeah, CPI. So the next thing, so the content that we actually serve up, again, that's CPI content, but it takes on various forms. So I already mentioned notifications. There's tiles, the concept of tiles, and that's what you would see in these applications. We call those tiles. So that is that's served up by a content management system. The notifications are delivered by push. And really, they all have pretty much the same attributes. They'll have a title, an icon image, a package name, tracking URL. We'll get into tracking URLs later. And then they also, this documentation is kind of in progress. So actually, they both tiles and notifications can have a big image. Notifications is really where it's used, because when you display the notification, do we have any screenshots of that notification? When you display the notification, it is a big, what's called a big image notification in Android. It's also used for the tiles can have the big image attribute. So an example would be if you see this Metro App Store page, behind it is a image representing, I think, Game of War or something like that, and it actually cycles through those images with like a fancy transition in the background. And so it's not used as often, but it can still be used. Notifications have some other kind of specific attributes, namely a campaign ID. And then when we get into the CMS, I guess there's also something called that you can do called a re-engagement notification. So it will, since all of these campaigns are based on paid per install, if we already have the app installed, we don't like to show the advertisement because there's no point. So the way that works in like the widget or where we show tiles is we kind of deprioritize those tiles to the bottom of the list if that app is already installed on the device. The way it works for notifications is we either don't show the notification at all if the app's already installed, or we have what's called a re-engagement notification, which we can say, okay, if they already have the app installed, show them this notification instead, and the use case is typically, or it was designed so that that notification would still be for the app, but it would be a deep link into the app itself to kind of re-engage the user with that application. I did mention in here that re-engagement notifications the content guys have actually, the guys who manage the content and run the campaigns, it can be abused or misused to anti-target. So instead of re-engaging the user with the application that's already installed, it can actually show a notification for another application. So basically you have a 1 or 2 scenario. If they have the app installed, if they don't have the app installed, show the primary one. If they do, show this one, and it could point to a different app, but that's not really what it was originally designed for. Yep.
And also the same re-engagement happens when you click on an app on the widget, and if it's not installed, then you'll be taken to the Google Play Store like normally. But if it's already installed, then it will open the app.
Yeah. So that's pretty much most of the documentation we've written. But I'm going to just walk through at a high level some of the different components of the platform. First one is the CMS. This is actually kind of being rebuilt right now, but this is the way it is currently. The CMS is where we manage the content that will show up in the widgets. You'll hear a term, content ops. Those are the guys that manage the content in the CMS. So I guess the first place to start is there's the notion of a catalog. So we have different catalogs based on the different products that consume content from the CMS and what carrier they're on. So you'll see V8 Sprint, that's pretty much the biggest one. V8 is an old internal term that refers to the top apps application, because it used to just be that, and it was called V8, and that was the whole project. Since then, there's those other applications I showed you that kind of do similar things. So V8 Sprint implies the top apps application on Sprint devices. It gets this catalog of content. So if I click show, you'll see all the content that is programmed in for the application to receive. These are all tiles. And there's also some configuration stuff. We can dynamically configure what Flurry API key to use to point to different sections of Flurry. We can tell it how long to refresh periodically. We can give it some theme stuff, like what background image should the widget have. Title icon is like the little icon in the top left that you see here is the Sprint icon. We can tell what the title should be, so top apps, etc. Usage call interval is how frequently it will send back a list of all the applications that are installed on the device. So that was historically, and you'll see it in the code. It's called app usage because it used to also tell in 30-second increments how frequently applications were being used. Android closed down that API, and now it's like pretty restricted. So it's just a list of all the applications that are installed. And currently this is at, I think that's 5 days. Every 5 days it'll send back that list. Update APK is basically these applications, in some way or another, depending on what option the carrier has given us, they will self-update. So they're not published in the Play Store. They're not. They don't install updates that way. They utilize either, if they themselves are installed on the system app priv app folder, which gives them privileges to install APKs, then it'll update itself altogether. Or, mainly in the case of Sprint provides an installer so Sprint has an installer that is installed on the privileged app folder, and then they expose an API by which we can tell them to update our APK. And you have to be signed by the Sprint certificate. Your APK has to be signed by the same certificate to have that permission. So since we came from Sprint and are still owned by Sprint, almost all of our applications are signed with that Sprint certificate, except for a couple that are deployed on another carrier, mainly Metro PCS.
Question.
Yeah.
Why don't you guys install this application as a system app so that the user can't remove it or anything like that?
So that they cannot remove it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat it too because I'm recording. So the question was, why don't we install our applications like Top Apps as a system app so the user can't uninstall it? So I can't speak to as to why originally that wasn't the case, but today the case is carriers and OEMs are pretty protective of that space on the device. They don't prefer to give, especially, so there's system app and there's system priv app. Priv app is like kind of admin privileges, right? You can do whatever you want. System app is, you're still part of the firmware, like if they factory reset, it'll still be there, but you don't have those elevated privileges. I don't know if we've explored doing just the system app yet. We're kind of trying to pitch that to Sprint. So it'd still be uninstallable, but whether it's priv app or system app, the user can still disable it. But all that to say, the priv app, they're pretty protective of, a lot of times they're pretty protective of that space because they want to have some control over what you're doing. And since while we are part of Sprint, we're also in some ways not Sprint, so it's not a, we try to treat Sprint as a customer as well, or vice versa, and so OEM and the OEMs too, like Samsung and LG, like they want to have a good reason for giving you those privileges, so I think they prefer the safer route for them, which is not putting us on the system app.
We actually do have Top Apps loaded as system app on probably just one or two carriers. They're not as big as Sprint or Boost, and they don't really care. So that's why they allow us to do that. But for the most part, we just load Top Apps normally.
Yeah. So on Metro PCS, it's on priv app. On iWireless, which is a small MVNO mobile virtual network operator, like a prepaid carrier basically. I don't know if is it on Unimax probably? Mm-hmm. So we've recently started trying to also, historically we just worked with, there's plenty of terms for it, MNO, carrier, whatever, mobile network operator. We've recently started trying to work with OEMs as well, because really all we need is someone to put us there, regardless. And there's two choices: the OEM or the carrier. I guess Google could, but that would never happen. So Unimax is a device manufacturer, an OEM that is loading us. I don't think they've actually rolled it out yet, but they would be putting us on the system priv app folder as well. So it happens, but the bigger carriers like Sprint, and if we ever did a deal with a bigger carrier, they would probably be reluctant to do so. That was a good question. So yeah, so the apps use this update APK URL and then the APK version to determine whether to update or not. So this is the Android version code. Basically, they'll just compare it with what's my current version code versus what's here in the feed. And we'll get into that later, but basically this whole catalog is transformed into a JSON feed that the client downloads periodically. And then if it is, then it takes this URL and does something with it, depending on where it is. And I can go ahead and I'm going to bring up the code just so I can I want this to be an Android-centric discussion, so I'll refer back to kind of the code
And
at a high level.
some of the configurations here are like we have like default values for them. So in the case that like it's first installing, there's no internet, and the application still works like as expected. But those configurations will be overridden by whatever on here later when the app tries to download the feed.
The original configuration file. Is that the one that you're talking about?
Maybe. Like the Flurry key, we have like default Flurry key on the like package bundle with the app. Doesn't say.
So, so just to show you an example for this, so what happens here is, I don't know if you guys have checked out the code for V8 SDK, but this is basically all the libraries that power the application. And the reason we put them into libraries is because all those libraries you see, Top Apps, App Spotlight, etc., they do like 90% at least the same thing, just with a different UI construct around it. So that's what the SDK is for, is kind of that core logic that's common across all the devices, or all the applications. The update, the way that happens is it takes, once it determines an update is available, it takes that URL, and that's represented here in this kind of domain object called an app update, which contains the URL, the size, and the version of the APK to be downloaded. And it basically goes through like a waterfall of how should I update. So it first checks, am I on the privileged folder? Can I just do that? Because that's the most preferred. So is privileged updater available? And then if it is, then that's what it's going to try to update with. The next one it prefers is the Sprint updater, and so on. And there's another one called ID. So Sprint used to offer, the Sprint ID application used to be able to do updates or installations as well, installing the APK, but then they came out with Sprint Installer, and I don't really know, because I wasn't really here when this was put into the code, but I don't know if both are still available, or if some older devices it's ID instead of Sprint Installer, but they were kind of doing the same thing. They're both from Sprint. So anyway, we check if the Sprint updater is available, then the Sprint ID updater. Pinsight updater is something basically for iWireless that we developed. So it's basically what the Sprint updater does. For some reason, I don't remember why, for iWireless we wanted to develop a separate APK installer application that had privileges and then expose that API back to Top Apps to do updates. So that only exists on iWireless. And then finally, if none of those are available, there's the option to, in some special cases, to what we call update manually, which is we would actually just send an intent to the Android system and say install this APK, and then the Android system would pop up. I don't know if you've ever seen that screen when you sideload an APK, and it pops up, you want to install, and if you have unknown sources, yeah. So we don't really ever do that, but there is the option in some really special cases if we wanted to force someone to upgrade, that is there. So I wanted to point that out because just to point to the fact that depending on what device it's on, what carrier it's on, it's going to treat this update process. Basically, it's going to try to do whatever's best first, which is the privilege updater, and then just gracefully degrade from there to what it has. So going on with the catalog, I won't get into this display type stuff yet. That doesn't even make sense for V8 Sprint anyway, so I don't know why it's there. It's usually only on like our 1x1 widgets. Yeah, here's the content. Just the tiles, basically, you get, I mean, this is probably, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this. You give it a title, you give it an icon, you give it a URL, and this URL is what is going to be followed when the user clicks the icon. You tell the package name so that the client application can determine whether it's installed or not. And so if it is installed based on this package name, then it will deprioritize this tile to the bottom of the list, so to prefer for the user to see one that's not installed. You can apply some filters to it based on Android version. You can give it some other rules like display timer, which would say, you know, only display it for so many minutes or hours. This day parting and day of week stuff, I don't think it's currently used, but it was built in. We were trying to do that at one point. I don't think the client ever got the logic to use it though. Like CPI and weight also, I don't think that's used. And then slot. Yep.
And then if you notice, there's EM, ES, and JA, the Spanish and Japanese, English. So basically, we support 3 different languages. And when the app make a request to our server, it's basically send a header, say like accept language something, and it pass in like either EM, ES, and depend on that language, the server will return like the respond with only apps like in the correct language.
Yeah. Yeah, so for a tile, you can choose what, I think there's a, oh, you know what, it's on the catalog level, I think. So on a catalog, you can tell it what languages you're going to support. And then what it does is when you go create a tile, it gives you fields for each of those languages that the catalog supports. So you can put in, this is what it should be if the accept language header is Spanish versus Japanese. I think we really only, Japanese was in there because we were working with SoftBank at one point to load top apps in Japan on SoftBank devices. But Spanish is used because we have a large Hispanic population and user base. So yeah, but mainly English.
Yeah. And it like EN or ES is on determined by what locale you set your device to. So if you set to any locale other than those 2, it will just use English. Right? English is the default.
English is the default. Yep. If we don't support the locale.
So these slots you guys have, so are these in order of how much they pay you for that?
No, and I'm gonna get into the slots actually, but I want to run through a couple other things first. So real quick, so these catalogs that you see in the CMS, the notion of a catalog is actually, that is not, if I just go create a catalog, that is not enough for the client to get the content. So the middle piece here is something called the engine. And so when the CMS makes a publish to publish content, and here it says publish to production, but this is still the dev environment. What it really means is publish this to be served up to the client versus staging would mean it's not, the client can come in, I don't know if we still support it, but the client could come in with a staging header and it would get content that was staging, kind of trialing or whatever. That's not the same as our server environments of dev, staging, and production. But basically when you publish this content, And the CMS is stored in a MySQL database. When it's published, that is transferred into a Redis database, and from which the component we call the engine server, reads it out of the Redis database and transforms it into a JSON feed and so the client hits the engine API to get content, and that content was given to the engine by the CMS. Some of that's in the works. Some changes are in the works for that. There's going to be an additional middleware called Fusion that will go CMS, Fusion, Engine, but the basic idea is still the same. Let's see if we... oh, this is useful. I will go there in a second. Is there a diagram for the...
if you go to my onboarding
Screen.
diagram for the CMS engine and
for the component,
what component?
like all the components, how they talk.
Let's go to that. Cooking. Well,
Which
that's about VA push. Well, if you go down, about VA push for more details.
Oh, that's the push flow diagram.
Yeah, but they
Okay.
have everything.
Okay. This might be useful. This is the AWS. So again, some of this is in flux, might change or is changing, but this is the basic. Clients come through to V8 Engine. Wish I had like a pointer or something. Oh, cool. Okay. Anyway. Clients come into the V8 engine. V8 engine pulls from the Redis database. And then if you see over here these admins, that's CMS. And then when you see, well, Rails CMS is, V8 admin is another term for CMS. And so you see that the CMS publishes this content to Redis. And I'll be honest, I don't know the difference between the Redis data store and the RDS data store. And then like when you upload images for that content, that actually itself doesn't go to the engine. That goes to S3 bucket. URL is generated, and then that URL is put into the Redis as part of the content that was published. The catalogs, as I was saying, the catalogs themselves, you can't just create a catalog and then the client can get content. There's the notion of a zone ID, and that is essentially a group ID that is unique to, basically the catalog names reflect it, but it's unique to the application and which carrier or OEM it's loaded on. So you'll see V8 Sprint, V8 Boost, V8 iWireless, all those mean top apps on this carrier. If you see the word V1, that refers to App Spotlight because that started as a one-by-one widget. So V1, it was V1 Pinsite because originally it was thought that we would have our own that would just not be carrier specific, but it kind of became, we wanted different versions, different catalogs for each carrier. So you'll see V1 Sprint, V1 Boost, etc. Some of the other applications, AppStack Boost, AppStack VMU, so you're kind of getting the idea there. So the zone ID is the unique identifier that is hard-coded into the client. So when the client makes its request, it says, my zone ID is V8 Sprint. And then the engine then knows what catalog to pull from. That is done through rule sets. So here are like the zone IDs, and this is just kind of like an abstract value in CMS. And then what you do is when we create a new zone ID, typically follows a convention like this, all lowercase, no special characters, um, all that stuff. So, and then correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but so the zone ID, since the client comes in with that, what we're doing here in the CMS is it's saying it's this notion of a filter is the engine's going to use a filter based on what's in the request. So it's going to look for request.zoneID. That's where the engine's going to look at to filter on what content that client should get as a response to that request. So the rule sets ties the two together. It says this zone ID should go to this catalog. So
Basically, just this ID, the catalog ID.
yeah, yep, catalog ID. So that's what the rule set is it matches, and it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's over abstracted, but it's kind of confusing for people on the team, I think, to understand what's going on here, because typically people only think in the terms of the catalog, and that's the end result. But when you want to go create a new catalog for a new partner or something, there's more than just creating a catalog. It's catalog. You have to create the abstract zone ID, which is just we come up with it ourselves. It's not generated by any software or anything, and then just tie the two together. And then on the client side, we go program in the zone ID appropriate for that client. Yeah, that is kind of the catalog management and zone ID stuff at a high level. And I'll just, again, to kind of keep it code centric, I'll point back to the code, so how this applies in the code. So you see for top apps, which again used to be called V8, we have a number of different product flavors based on which partner we're loaded on. Sprint in this context, refers to actually Sprint, Boost, and Virgin Mobile, because those are all under Sprint. Yeah, Boost and Virgin Mobile are kind of managed under Sprint pretty closely. The difference there is kind of like QLink, for example. QLink is a mobile virtual network operator. They run on the Sprint network, but they're not owned by Sprint. Sprint has a wholesale setup where they contract with QLink. QLink uses their towers, etc. So that's kind of the difference there, but they're still on the Sprint mobile network, so to speak. But Boost and Virgin are more managed and owned directly by Sprint Corporation. So when it comes to zone ID, the zone ID is determined through a string file, and we name the file V8 SDK. The V8 SDK picks up whatever is in here. So this top apps application depends on the V8 SDK, and then the V8 SDK expects that application that's depending on it to have this string value defined. And that value is V8 SDK default zone ID. So here you see for top apps, the default zone ID is V8 Sprint, and the Sprint product flavor. And then we might want to get into this a little bit later, but all these, they're called resource qualifiers in Android. All of these MCC 310, 120, etc. Those are almost like unique IDs for a carrier. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but mobile country code and mobile network code. So each one of these maps back to, like 310, 120 is Sprint, 311, 490 is Virgin Mobile. So the way we hard code the zone ID for under the Sprint product flavor and then differentiate between Sprint, Boost, and Virgin is by this mobile network code. And I think SoftBank is technically still in there, but again, that's Sprint prepaid. I think this one is SoftBank. Yeah, but this is where if for some reason we need to add a new one or change V8 Sprint to become V8 Sprint T-Mobile because Sprint and T-Mobile merged or something. I don't know. We would go edit this string. This would be the first place. Go edit that string file because all of this, anything under this V8 SDK XML is to configure how the V8 SDK interacts with the other components like the engine and this default furry key. That's like, what do I use as my furry key if I haven't gotten a feed yet? Things like that. So I think that's a good pause point for CMS content related stuff. Do you guys or E-Man or anyone have any questions or additions?
It's a similar question. Not a minor. Like, how do these apps approach a platform, like a business platform, is there any process?
How do they what now?
How do the apps that we are showing on the tiles, how do they approach these address the platform?
How do they approach? Do you mean like how would we
Select applications that we want to place them?
how do we define what content gets programmed in?
What apps get placed?
Yeah, so like if we
Like which apps?
so yeah, like how do we know we want BoostKit versus whatever? Yeah, so the question is how do we determine what content we want to display? So that in these widgets, what we want to program. So that is something called the demand side of the business. So basically you have folks who will go out to app publishers and basically strike deals with, for example, Hulu or something. And they'll say, hey, we have all this supply. We're on X number of devices. We project we can get you this number of installs. Let's negotiate a deal and let's do $5 per install or something. And so they strike a deal like that. Once the deal is struck, then it's okay. They make the decision on we're going to put it in the catalog starting this date. So it's basically like advertising deals. Some of the deals are what's called indirect. So there might be a company who stands between Pinsite and the app publisher. So the app publisher has gone to, and I don't know an example name here, but whatever indirect company that says, hey, I don't care where you put me, you have access to a lot of supply, so I'll pay you X number per installs. And then that indirect seller will then go to Pinsite, to whatever other partners they have for advertising, and say, hey, I have Hulu, and I'll pay you X number per install, and it kind of dilutes the CPI because it's more indirect down the chain. But either way, the idea is just who's paying us the most money, basically for install, and how we get the partnerships with whoever is trying to advertise content, because the reason this is pretty successful is because this is kind of prime real estate. So especially if you're maybe if you're an app developer and the app the market is so crowded with applications, it's hard to get noticed. So since this is on the home screen by default for Sprint Android devices, it's pretty good real estate to get your app seen by people and installed. So that's what drives.
How does the sorting was done for the tiles inside the widget?
Yeah, so the question is how the sorting is done. So, and by sorting you mean like from the business sense, how do we prefer which one is? Yeah, so there's a number of business rules that go into that. So one is I don't think, if we look at the widget and we look at these 8 spots, the last I heard is there's not really any preference to which spot it's in per se. I think they've tried to see, does the first one perform better than the last one or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. So from a business perspective, I think it's more about and you can see there's more apps in the catalog than what shows in the widget. So it's more about who do we want to put. They use the term above the fold. Above the fold would mean it's going to be shown by default, and it's not like the user has to install applications that to make the list shift up. So typically it's just more who's in, who's out on the widget, and who's paying us the most right now versus maybe there's a lower CPI deal and it's there's 8 spots here, so it's the 9th spot, so it won't show up until someone installs one of these other applications. So that's kind of the business side of it. It's just kind of like top 8 or top 4 that we want shown if we have to pick, choose what users are going to see by default. But then on the technical side, there's ordering and business rules to how to determine, BoostKit shows up in the first spot, etc. And it doesn't necessarily tie back to like a demand side thing, priority, but it's more about, so basically, the first thing is we don't want to show installed apps, if at all possible, because anytime an app is installed, everything still works, and like Ang said, if the user clicks an app, if we're showing an app that's already installed, say BoostKit's already installed, it'll just open the app. But the problem is we're missing out on that could have been a space for something else that wasn't installed that we would have gotten paid for if they installed it. So there's a lot of ordering into what to show there. So the primary one is once we get the feed with all of these apps, that's kind of like a baseline. And then we manipulate it based on the state of the device and order it. So the first one is we go through and shuffle and we say, okay, we don't want to show any installed apps. So those get moved to the bottom, and we can get into all the kind of SQL stuff that's going on to do those queries. And then the second one is there is the notion of priority here in CMS. So if you see priority 1, 2, 3, 4. There's kind of a two-dimensional list going on here. So let me, I think, yeah. So, and this goes back to your question about the slots. So the widget has the capability, or really all the clients have the capability. It's two-dimensional. There's depth to the list. So originally, or maybe not originally, but maybe primarily you can think about it this way, and this is a 1 to n list: priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, priority 4. At some point in the history of the product, they wanted to be able to sell to, I think it was to Amazon actually. You're always gonna be in this first spot. So the notion of slots came about, which gives you a two-dimensional list. So now the way it works, the ordering logic is if there's anything assigned to slot 1, and you see here in the CMS there's something put in slot 1, then the first position in the list, so if I go back here to where BoostKit is, will only show content that is assigned to slot 1. So I can put more content in here, and basically the widget will only look at slot 1 for content to display. It will never dip into other areas of the catalog. But that's only if something is assigned to slot 1. So the other notion is an unassigned slot, or the unassigned slot, and that is slot -1. So it's, for some reason, someone decided that's what they would call it. But slot -1 basically means I'm not so concerned about what position in the widget this shows up, but I do have a priority order for for which one should show up over the next one. And these numbers aren't refreshing, but if not too long ago, basically all top apps is they basically just had slot -1 loaded, so they were just using it as a one-dimensional list. So there's still a priority there, and so that's where you have the distinction between slot versus priority. Slot is kind of the first thing we look at. Is there something that when we're building our list of content on the client side of what to display when we're querying the database, we say let's first check if there's anything assigned to slot 1. And one thing to note, like say A is installed, then it's going to try to go to B, and if B is installed, it's going to try to go to C. If C is installed, it still is self-contained or sandboxed into slot 1, so it's actually just going to rotate back to A. So it's like a hard requirement. Don't show content that's from other places. So that's kind of the difference. And then for when we're building this list on the client side, we're querying the database, the local database in the app of what content is available. We say if we query and we see there are no items assigned to slot 3, for example, there's nothing that was put in slot 3 on the CMS, then it pops the first one off like a stack, pops the first one off the unassigned slot to display. So that's the next kind of layer of how it works. So you could think of the unassigned slot as kind of another slot in and of itself. So for like position 3 on the widget, if nothing is assigned to slot 3, it's going to try to pick the first one off of slot -1. If that one's installed, it's going to go to the next available one, and it's going to keep going. And it will use slot -1 as kind of a pool. And so if you have multiple unassigned slots, they're all using the same pool of slot -1 and trying to pick the first one available. But since this is position 3 versus, say, position 8 has nothing assigned to it, position 3 is going to have the first dibs to pick off of this pool. And then once we get to position 8, while we're building the list, it would be whatever else is available as the next best one. So it can get kind of complex thinking about it, but basically it's a two-dimensional way of prioritizing. Slot, then the term is priority. Yep.
I have a question.
Okay.
So that on the side, slot 3, will that be the first app in slot -1, or will it be the third app?
The first one. Yep. Because up to this point, while we're building our list and querying the database, in the client-side code, we've seen there's something assigned to slot 1. So now I'm only concerned with things that are assigned in slot 1 for that position in the UI. Same applies to slot 2. I've seen there's something that has been assigned to slot 2. So for the second position in the list of what I display, I'm only concerned with things that are assigned to slot 2. So when I get to slot 3, there's nothing assigned to slot 3. What's my first available option in slot -1?
From what I remember, we actually first we put in like all A slots on the side apps, and then we go through each slot and see if we have any apps for that slot, and then we basically replace the current one with the one actually in that slot.
Okay.
So if that is the case, then shouldn't it be app 3 versus app 1? Or I'm missing something?
That might be how the code works. That might be a bug, but this was the original design, which was as soon as I get to an unassigned, give me the best one from the unassigned pool. So yeah, that might be an error on our part for how we do our queries and stuff. And then I'll just add, I guess, as we're building our list and querying the database, say we're looking at slot 1 now, we've done our query, we know there are items that are assigned to slot 1. There's priority within that, so what order is it in within the slot? But there's more rules than that. So the first one, again, is whether it's installed or not. I don't care about priority. If it's installed, it becomes deprioritized. There's another one called display timer, which I kind of spoke about, but it would basically say if this app, Alphabeti Saga, had a display timer of 1 hour, and I go to render the widget again, and I see that Alphabeti Saga has been displaying for 1 hour, or that it's displayed, it's kind of happens behind the scenes in parallel, but if I see that its display timer is expired, has been expired by the other component that manages expiring them in the database. Basically, just it flips a flag in the database when the time is expired. So when I'm querying the database, I first check, is it installed? Is it expired? And if it's not installed, but then it's expired, again, I don't care about the priority. It becomes deprioritized. And then there's a third one, which we don't have to get too much into, but they actually, at one point, wanted to have top apps and the App Spotlight widget communicating so that if something was displaying in the App Spotlight widget, we wouldn't display it in top apps. So that would be a third, what's called like an exclusion criteria, if you will, that we would say, okay, it's not installed, it's not expired, but oh, it's displaying in App Spotlight. Okay, so those are all things that would make it get deprioritized to the bottom of the list and make it move on to the next one as far as priority goes by numbering or ordering it within the slot. So that is a primer on content.
Yeah. Drew?
Yep.
Emmanuel here. I have a question, a general question.
Yep.
How do you think is the best way for a new developer coming in to, contribute to the team and bring value to the table? Like, what's the best way to go about being effective as a new member of the team?
So, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna actually repeat your question because I don't know if on the recording they can hear you coming through my speakers.
All right.
But for the recording, I'm repeating the question that Emmanuel had, which is what is the best way to be effective as a new developer on the team? Where can you contribute the most value? That's a really good question that now I feel like I have to think about. So thanks for putting me on the spot. No, I'm just kidding. And Aang can help me out too. I would say, if we're being honest, I know that. So there's a couple aspects to this answer. This doesn't really apply to the remote teammates, but probably the best possible way to contribute value would actually be, maybe not all the time, but spending some time paired programming or mirroring or shadowing, whatever you want to call it, because this is a pretty complex platform. It's a little deceptive with the widget that like any Android developer would look at that and be like, okay.
But engine V8 SDK is complex.
Yes, the V8 SDK is pretty, but there's so much more behind it, and like Nanish just said, all this V8 SDK stuff is behind it, powering it with a lot of business use cases, business logic, a lot of stuff going on. So the first way, and again, this isn't necessarily directly contributing value, but one of the best ways to get up to speed is it's a learning process. Like we could sit here and have a session all day, but paired programming and shadowing is going to get you more familiar because you're going to be watching someone who's more experienced with it, how they work and how their mindset works within the code. And I'll just say from experience, so I was the only Android developer on the team before this started like scaling really big. And I think right around the time Aang, I was starting to put things into the V8 SDK and stuff. That might have been when you were an intern or something. But when Aang joined the team more full-time, he basically just did most everything with me. And then he would, I think he would ask a lot of questions when he was doing something on his own. So he was very, very curious and very, very eager to learn how it would work, and then also willing to just watch me do things and take my advice on how this is how the system works, or this is how we do things within the system. So that's the first thing, because when you do that, then that will allow you to be able to contribute value faster than just kind of guessing on your own. So leaning on the teammates and the people who are more experienced in the code base. We don't mind. I don't mind. I mean, seriously, I don't mind commentating, narrating every single thing I'm doing, just to explain, kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing, and you can ask questions. I don't care. I think that's really helpful to the team. So that's the first thing. But we have some folks remote too, our teammates in Russia. So I would say, I don't know. I'd have to think more on that. But I think as long as you guys that are remotely ask questions, and if we have to have a call every now and then and synchronize times just to hammer through any questions you may have, that would be a good way. Reading documentation, maybe even maybe on our part, the people in the office, when we have merge requests, and we'll get into workflow maybe another time, but when we do merge requests, maybe on our part we should be very verbose in our commenting within the merge request. So it's easier for us a lot of times to just talk face to face about the code and not go type the comment into GitLab or something. But it might help them if we kind of discipline ourselves to, hey, let's kind of describe what we're doing here in the merge request, so that our remote folks can go back, and even when the merge request is passed, they can still go back into the history and read, basically doing our best to compensate for the lack of their physical presence and providing a trail, if you will, of things for them to follow and kind of pick up on. So just being hungry to learn, I think, whatever format that takes, doing the most of that. And then the next step would be starting to get your hands dirty and working on some tasks that are you feel like you can work on, and then again, but not going and doing it completely on your own and waiting until merge request. But as you're doing it, talk about it with Aang, talk about it with me, or Eman or whomever. Talk about it, and just be willing to put it in the Slack. We're all teammates. We can all just talk about it and talk about what the best way to do it is and why. So lots of communication, lots of questions. Yeah.
Cool.
And I would just add that like whatever you get assigned to, basically just if you think you cannot find what to look at to solve that problem, then we just come and ask us, and we be able to point you to okay, here's some of the modules you have to look at, and here's some of the classes, and basically we point you to the right direction, and then I'll say from there, just try go in and learn and see whatever that module, whatever is doing, and then think about how you're going to solve it, and then come back to us and basically just ask questions, and then see if you guys doing the right things or not. But yeah, just learn one at a time, and then I guess after 100 years, you just getting
100.
Probably a few months, you'll be familiar enough or confident enough to work independently.
Yeah, and one more thing I would add too, back to contributing value. As you're working on something or asking something and you get the answer, first before we ask, we all have to be willing to read what's already there, what code comments are there, what documentation is there, and if it's not sufficient, and we talk about it with the team or we ask someone, and I need to do a lot better job of this too, is once you have the answer, put the answer somewhere for the next person. So if it's something really is unclear in the code, it's a really long method, which we'll get into kind of practices that we try to have. Hopefully it's not a really long method. We try to keep things isolated and clean. But if it's a really long, nasty method or a class that just it's not making sense what's happening, or there's no code comments or anything, we talk about it. We get the answer wherever the appropriate place is to record that answer down for the next person. That's extreme value that you can contribute as a new team member. Is once you have your answer, put it in the code comments. Hey, this is what this is doing, and it talks to this component. Or if it doesn't really belong in the code comments, it's more of a conceptual question. If there's even, I know it's not super organized, but even if you just get it somewhere at the very least on the wiki, even if you just create a new page, and it's not organized under any folder or anything, the first step is just getting it somewhere so that maybe the next person can find it, and that will add a ton of value to the team, because there's a lot of complexity, and we all need to pull our weight and kind of making it clear through code comments and documentation how things work and what we expect. So yeah, that was a really good questioning, man.
Cool. Thanks. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Especially for me, it's been a couple of months, but even though I've learned a lot, I'm still, and I feel more comfortable, I'm still, there's always more to learn. And I think communication, as you said, communication is the biggest factor, right? The question asking and being hungry to learn.
Absolutely, yeah. And being willing, and I think humble enough to,
correct,
and bold enough to shadow, and
correct.
You have to be both. You have to be willing to say, I want to learn. Aang, help me learn, or E-Man, help me learn, or even or even between us guys who have been here, not the new, E-Man being willing to shadow Aang, or vice versa. Like, let's just taking the opportunity to just look over the shoulder and just understand why someone's doing what they're doing. Is super helpful. $10 an hour, says Aang. Yeah, so basically have 5 minutes left. I think we'll definitely have to continue this maybe Friday, or I don't know, Monday, or Monday we're off, I think, Tuesday or sometime next week.
Are you going to send out a schedule or an agenda of what the next discussion would be?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can schedule it sometime today.
Okay.
Maybe Friday. I'll be remote Friday, but this seemed to work okay.
Okay.
So maybe we'll do it Friday.
All right. Awesome.
And then for the remote guys, we'll schedule a call for them to ask questions, a 1 hour, kind of after they've reviewed the video and the documentation, any questions they might have.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. Good session. We're kind of probably, I don't know if we're 20% through, but we got into some really good stuff, I think. So really good, starting on the right foot. So hope this was helpful.
For some reason, it sounds like a podcast session. Like we're just missing a microphone.
I know. Yeah. All right. Cool.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, E-Man.
All right.
Catch you later.
Okay.
Thing